Welcome to the Nemeth Report podcast. I'm Dr. Tammy Nemeth, historian and independent researcher, and I'll be your host. With the recent re-election of a minority Liberal government, with the lowest popular vote for a winning party since the founding of Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has declared he has a mandate to pursue stronger climate change measures and continue with the mad rush to a net zero future, even though that was barely a topic of discussion during the election. Like net zero, there are at least two different levels of discussion on climate change. There is the simplistic characterization of Earth's climate in chaos. You've heard the slogans. The Earth is on fire. Climate emergency. Mass extinctions. Code red. The rhetoric gets louder and more alarmist and hysterical with every passing year. The villain here, the blame, if you will, for every sensationalized weather event and natural disaster is you, me, and our modern industrial civilization. The solution to the ever-impending global crises is more government control and a complete overhaul, a complete transformation of our current society. But when alarmist claims and potentially catastrophic policy directions are questioned by well-informed people, including various scientists, then we are told the situation is so complex that only specialized scientists and experts, especially those involved with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, are permitted to speak on the issues and suggest or make policy. Thus, by claiming complexity and scientific authority, business and political leaders feel compelled to concede the point that human behavior is causing climate change, nothing else. They don't want to raise the ire of loud and obnoxious activists whose antics are given media prominence. These complementary and concurrent strategies make it seem like climate issues are urgent and complex and that governments need to act now to change everything about how we live, or all will be destroyed. But is that the case? Joining me today to discuss these issues of climate change and the IPCC is Robert Lyman. With a career in the federal public service spanning 37 years and several years working as a consultant on energy and environmental issues, Mr. Lyman has written many reports on these issues. Several of these are available on the Friends of Science website. He has also been invited to testify before parliamentary committees, most recently in May 2021, when he presented a brief titled, "The Role of Green Energy in Canada's Economic Recovery from the Pandemic." Thank you for joining me today, Bob. Before we begin, would you like to add anything to my very brief introduction of your quite extensive background?
I said that I was very happy to be invited to speak to you today. I didn't have anything else to add.
Okay, so my little brief introduction was enough?
Yes, that was fine. It was fine.
So I think a good place to start is this whole idea of a climate emergency, because, many cities and provincial and state authorities and even some nations have made this declaration that there's a climate emergency. And so, do you think there is one? Is there a climate emergency with tipping points and mass extinctions and carbon emission budgets? What do you think about that? Is there a climate emergency?
Well, the short answer is no. I do not think there's a climate emergency. I don't think that the number of species that have been gone extinct have increased. In fact, they've been declining decade by decade. And the notion that there are finite carbon budgets is really just an artifact, and it represents a flawed understanding of the climate problem. As I'm sure you're aware, the tradition of making catastrophic claims is a long one. It goes back to Thomas Malthus in the 18th century, and every prediction of gloom and doom has proven wrong, but they're good for headlines, so the tradition continues. The claims that there are a climate emergency really devolve largely from the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, and its use of mathematical models that attempt to predict the effects of increasing greenhouse gas emissions on future temperatures and on the world economy. The and also the fact that the IPCC injects assumptions that the modelers should use, and it suggests the scenarios that they should use in their models. After the 2015 Paris Agreement, there were a number of additional meetings that were held by the modelers, and the IPCC in particular interjected into their work a proposed scenario, which was called Representative Pathways 8.5. And 8.5 was in effect a worst case scenario. It relied upon an assumption of significantly increasing coal consumption worldwide right out to 2070. And that and other aspects of it have made people realize that it was a scenario that is implausible and borderline impossible. But nonetheless, after the IPCC fifth assessment report, it was basically accepted by the IPCC not as the worst case, but as the business as usual case.
Yeah. And
that has been the scenario that has been used by most of the analyses subsequently of what may happen. Since it is a worst case, it of course results in claims of alarm and predictions that the transitions in the energy system must occur on virtually an emergency basis.
Right. One of the things that I talked with Donna Leframboise about, and she made a good point, is she said, like, honestly, after her research, she thought the IPCC ought to be disbanded because just of how manipulated a lot of this stuff was. And even though there were a few really good scientific reports and there are people who were trying to do good due diligence and whatnot, over time, there's been fewer and fewer of those sort of good scientific reports. And in the end, it's all summarized and sort of debated on a line-by-line basis with political people on how this ought to be communicated to the media and policymakers. And she said it really ought to be disbanded. And what you've kind of described sort of helps make her case for that, because if they told the modelers, I want you to include this extreme worst case scenario, and then it's rolled out to the media and everybody else as business as usual, that's not necessarily perhaps a proper way that these kinds of things ought to be done.
Well, I'm to claim that the IPCC should be terminated is a bit extreme. I think that it's critical for the international climate policy debate to have an injection of sound science, and there are in the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change bodies many scientists who I'm sure are working very diligently to try to come up with the best assessment that they can of the underlying global conditions and of the role that human emissions, if any, might play in changing those conditions. There's no doubt, though, that they operate in a highly politicized environment. And even when they do excellent scientific work, the reports that they publish are then summarized by the officials that work within the United Nations. And they, in turn, are heavily influenced by environmental campaigners, so that what's called the summary for policymakers end up being documents that read much more like political treatises than scientific documents. So I'm not trying to, if you will, excuse the errors that they make in their modeling exercises, but rather to just put it in the context of the political environment in which they work. I mean, at the end of the day, a mathematical model of how the world's climate works is at best a very complex simulation. And the value of it is entirely dependent upon the quality of the equations that go to make it up, the assumptions that underlie it, and the scenarios. And as is always the case with those types of exercises, the value of the output is entirely a function of the value of the inputs. I worked in the energy policy field for many years, and I worked with many people who attempted using econometric models to do projections of what future energy supply and demand and emissions conditions would be. And I was always amused by them because they had a saying. It was, to err is human, to get paid for it is divine.
Yeah, when I'm glad you mentioned econometrics, because when I look at the climate models, sometimes I think of the econometric studies that were done in the 80s, especially with respect to energy. So thank you for making that sort of comparison. So with the idea of the climate emergency, quite often it comes back to extreme weather events. And I'm wondering, based on the sort of research and whatnot that you've been doing in the IPCC reports, is there actually extreme weather? Has it been getting worse?
Well, Tammy, my primary expertise is in the area of economic policy, and more specifically energy policy. And most of my writings have been about climate policy, and from that perspective, I should state right at the outset that I don't present myself as a scientist, and my judgments on it are based entirely upon what I have heard and read from people who are experts in that area. But certainly, my understanding is that if you look at most of the indices of extreme weather events, whether they relate to temperatures, whether they relate to hurricanes, whether they relate to tornadoes or to droughts, floodings, by and large, it's very difficult to discern a significant influence of greenhouse gas emission levels. In most cases, the variations have been within the range that is expected historically. And I mean, if you will, the bottom line of all that is that over the last 100 years, there's been a 90% decline in the number of deaths that are associated with extreme weather events, notwithstanding the fact that the populations have, of course, increased, and the people who live in the areas that are typically affected by extreme weather events have also increased. But a 90% decline in the fatalities from those events. I mean, that alone tells you that there's an exaggeration of both the effects and the role that greenhouse gas emissions play.
Right, and it also, I think, makes a good argument for the supporting adaptation, right, and being able to adapt to our different surroundings and being able to be more robust in how we respond to different weather events.
Yes, I wrote a paper for the Friends of Science on precisely that subject, arguing that right now the world is spending about 95% of the resources that it commits to addressing climate measures on mitigation, and only about 5% on adaptation. And yet the evidence in terms of the level of emissions in the world is that since 1990, emissions have grown by 60%, notwithstanding all of the money spent on mitigation. And if it is true that the world will have some significant events that are related to rising carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere, it's probably likely that we'll have several decades to adapt to it. And as Bjorn Lomborg, the Danish statistician and economist has stated many times, the projected increase in global income over the period to 2100 is so large, notwithstanding whatever climate effects may occur, that the world will be easily able to afford adaptation expenses to deal with any problems that arise.
If it's spent properly. And I'm glad you brought Lomborg in, because I look at who he advises, because he has these amazing ideas on how best to prioritize a budget, a national budget, in order to adapt and mitigate to some extent climate issues or weather issues or whatever. And his clients are primarily, in fact, almost always developing countries, because they don't have as much money and they want to make sure it's being spent, I guess, better. And it's unfortunate that more developed countries aren't listening necessarily to the arguments that he's making about prioritization and how we could be spending the money much better than we are.
Well, Lomborg makes a case that's near and dear to the heart of every economist, and that is that when governments consider responses to major policy problems, they should pursue them from the perspective of minimizing the costs and maximizing the benefits. And in Canada, it may well be the case in the UK and elsewhere, the federal government has never done a cost-benefit analysis of the measures that it is implementing to address climate change. That may sound astounding, given that we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, but it's never done that. In fact, it doesn't even have an inventory of all of the measures that are currently underway at the federal and provincial government levels. So they have no systematic way to assess to what extent the costs that are being incurred by society will yield benefits. The additional insight that I think that Lomborg adds is that when you are talking about those benefits, which is presumably the reduction in adverse climatic effects and the reduction in extreme weather events to the extent that they're occurring, you have to compare that to the benefits that would accrue if the countries of the world used a comparable level of resources to addressing other significant problems. I mean, he notes particularly problems like malaria in Africa or childhood diseases in various countries, or even something economic like increasing electricity. I mean, there are over 1.5 billion people in the world who do not have access to electricity. And if we devoted only a tiny portion of the amount of money that is now being spent on climate measures to ensuring that the entire world's population had access to electricity, we would have much, much higher benefit. But again, the issue is so politicized that I find it quite rare to find any government that is prepared to address it from that kind of a comparative cost and benefit perspective.
Why do you think that is? I mean, it's like the politicians and the business leaders, the corporate leaders, they want to concede the point of human-caused climate change to the point where it's like they can't even entertain an idea or a policy response that may in any way undermine the larger alarmist narrative. So why do you think that is?
So that's a very difficult question. Because it requires me to
speculation, right?
Look into the minds of political leaders. It's certainly the case in Canada, and it may well be the case in the UK and Europe as well, that the political dynamic that surrounds climate policy discussions is very heavily influenced by activist environmental groups. And they're well funded. They're well funded both in terms of the funds that they receive from their domestic supporters, but in Canada's case, there have been hundreds of millions of dollars that have been spent by U.S. foundations and to some extent European foundations to fund these environmental groups. They, in addition, and quite extraordinarily here, some 2/3 of the funding that these groups have comes from governments themselves. If you compare the funding for environmental campaigners in Canada, you will find that it runs to the hundreds of billions of dollars. Yeah, and that dwarfs not only the funding that is available to groups that seek to debate them, if you will, people that are more concerned about economic development and growth than about the environmental issues. It vastly exceeds the funding that is available to political parties in Canada. So, in Canada, the Green Party has only a marginal role in politics, and in fact, in our most recent election, their percentage of the vote actually declined. Almost all of the mainstream political parties in Canada have embraced the green agenda, and they see it as something that they must pursue if they're to achieve votes in the urban centers. So you have a situation where the environmental alarmists, if you will, are extremely well funded, very politically astute, well organized, and the people who take an opposing view are often shunned. Really, I mean, I can give you a number of examples of cases where people who are extremely well-regarded scientists have been prevented from publishing their work or from speaking at public events, and where it is almost impossible for someone who is a skeptic, of course, often called a denier, to be published in Canada. So it's a series of very troubling events that I think undermines the quality of our democracy as well as the quality of our debates on climate policy issues.
That's a really good point. And I don't think it's confined just to Canada. In the UK, for example, the BBC, I think it was 4 or 5 years ago, said they would no longer include skeptical viewpoints when they were debating climate change. And that they just came out right and said that was their policy. Well, how are you supposed to be fair and balanced when you're not even, you say there's a debate, but then again, they say there isn't a debate. The science is settled, right? And I feel like the skeptical scientists or the ones who question it, who just, want to explore the questions openly and fairly, they're pushed to the sideline. So if you go to a website like What's Up With That, there's all of this robust debate and discussion about minutiae of different scientific papers and investigations and whatnot. And it's so uplifting in some ways to read those vibrant debates, but they're over there on the margin. They've been marginalized, sidelined, and trying to engage in a wider debate, it ends up, name calling and everything else, like using the denier label, which is just offensive. But, I don't know what to do about it, but I guess this is one way to try and raise awareness for people out there that there is a debate, there is a discussion going on, and hopefully people can become more aware of it and become engaged in it.
Well, yes, I agree. I mean, the reality is that there are a very large number of prominent scientists who dissent from the view that greenhouse gas emissions at current and projected levels will result in catastrophic results. There in fact is a broad consensus that human emissions have some warming effect on the Earth. There is a consensus that emissions have grown over the course of the last century and a half, and that they perhaps have had the effect of increasing global average temperatures by something slightly in excess of 1 degree centigrade. There generally tends to be a consensus that some public policy action should be taken. Where there is no consensus is on the likelihood that this will result in catastrophic effects. There's no consensus on the likelihood that action by countries internationally is likely to have any significant impact in terms of reducing emissions. There certainly is no consensus on what the economic consequences will be. So all of the really important issues are ones where there is no consensus. There remains a large number of scientists and economists and people who are broadly concerned about public policy who dissent. But it takes a lot of courage for them to continue doing so.
Right. Absolutely. And I'm grateful that that the dissenters still dissent, and I'm happy for their courage. So with respect to the Western governments, and I sort of want to go back a little bit to what you said about electrifying the developing nations, and there's still over 1 billion people who don't have access to reliable electricity. And I was talking to Robert Bryce, who wrote A Question of Power, and he made a documentary that went along with it called Juice. And he traveled to the developing countries and asked them, what would make your life better? And they're like, can we just have constant, reliable electricity? Because he found in various developing nations, people would be trying to tap it onto the lines, and how terrible it was. And then he went to some communities where the environmentalists had been trying to push renewable energy. And the renewable battery packs or whatever could charge a mobile phone or a cell phone for like 12 minutes or something like that. And that was it. That's all they had access to. And they would have to sit there with the kids at the table trying to do their schoolwork at night with a candle or burning something or whatever, because they'd used up all their electricity to charge their devices. And I think of how the Western nations are discouraging developing nations from pursuing reliable, affordable hydrocarbons and to embark upon this renewable disaster. And now they're trying to change our own Western economy and civilization by promoting renewable technology as well. So what to you are the sort of policy directions that the Western governments have taken to go on this pathway? What sort of policies are they, and do you think they'll be effective, and will it help human flourishing?
Well, most of the actions that have been taken by Western countries to affect the investment in the developing countries in renewable energy have been done through international organizations. The World Bank, for example, and the various regional economic associations that are supposedly there to help further economic development in the poorer countries, have almost all changed their policies as a result of pressure from Europe and the United States and some other countries, so that they exclude from eligibility for financing any investment in coal-fired power plants. The irony is that coal-fired power plants are often far and away the least expensive of the incremental generation opportunities that are available to those countries. Whereas, and of course, that type of generation is far more reliable. There's great irony there, of course, because while they're taking that position with respect to the countries that can barely afford to improve their electricity generation systems, China and India and Turkey and many other countries in Asia are building coal-fired power plants at historic rates. And in many cases, China has until recently been financing those types of developments in other countries as well, much to the benefit of China in geopolitical terms. Sure. But it goes beyond that as well. The many countries in their foreign policies or their foreign aid policies have also been prioritizing investments in wind and solar energy, regardless of its cost and unreliability, compared to any fossil fuel plants. And there is this enormous issue of financing under the terms of the Paris Agreement. You may remember that the Paris Agreement included a provision that, in fact, I think it originated in 2012 in a previous UN meeting, that the countries that are called the Annex II countries, largely the OECD countries, would contribute at least $100 billion a year in funds to the Green Climate Fund of the United Nations, which was intended to support the adjustments in the less developed countries to climate change, both in terms of adaptation and mitigation. And of course, it was very easy for the United Nations to come to an agreement on that as a principle. They have never subsequently been able to agree on the apportionment either of the payment obligations or the recipient benefits. And that will be a major controversy at the next coming conference in Glasgow. But what has actually happened with that Green Climate Fund is that after several years of being rather moribund, they've finally begun to increase the amount of funding that they have available. I've lost track of what it was, but it's something in the order of $20 billion total now, not $100 billion a year. But just to think about what that might mean in terms of political controversies, while they have not yet decided on how they would apportion the payment obligations, one can assume it would be generally related to the gross domestic products of the countries that are required to pay. And if you look at the gross domestic products of those countries, the United States is about the largest, with something in the order of 30% of the GDP of those Annex II countries. Well, at $100 billion a year, that means that the U.S. annual obligation would be $30 billion. And Canada's obligations would be in the order of $3 billion just for green power development, the Green Climate Fund. In the case of the UK, it's probably something in the order of $4.5 to $5 billion annually that the UK would have to pay into the Green Climate Fund if it were to meet this obligation. That's not going to happen, in my opinion. We'll see what comes out of the Glasgow conference, but it really indicates how unrealistic many of the claims have been about the amount of funding that can be made available for the developing countries, and what the adverse effects of denying funding for more conventional energy are.
Right. And so then that comes to sort of what the Western countries are doing internally, because there's this movement and the various scare stories or smear stories coming out saying that they need to end fossil fuel subsidies, which are just a joke because they're considering tax write-offs a subsidy. But I think in some of your research, you've put together some numbers on the amount of subsidies that renewable energy gets. Seems to get a free pass when they're talking about government subsidies.
Well, that is a topic that is a very kind of sensitive one with me. Again, it comes down to this question of whether governments have kept a tally at all of what subsidies are being paid. One of the papers that I did examined the subsidies that are available to renewable energy in Canada in particular. And I'm talking by renewable energy here, I'm talking about wind and solar power generation as well as biomass. And I identified 23 different ways in which governments of Canada, provided subsidies or significant market advantages to renewable energy sources. And no one's ever come up with an accurate estimate of what the value of those subsidies are in Canada. But it's significant not only because of the cost to the public purse, but because that means that when people make the claim that renewable energy, when it's sold, is so economical, they're utterly ignoring the portion of that cost that the taxpayer pays.
Right.
In the United States, they've been quite a bit more diligent in keeping track of how much is being spent in terms of subsidies to the renewable energy industries. And the Texas Policy Foundation did a marvelous study a few years ago, and they basically came out. I'm a little bit unclear on precisely the totals, but I believe that over the period from 2010 to 2018, the U.S. federal government provided something in the order of $30 billion in subsidies for wind and another $30 billion in subsidies for solar energy. And that the result of that was to totally alter the economic attractiveness of different energy sources for the utilities. The comparative contributions to in so-called subsidies, as you say, they mostly have to do with write-offs for capital investments for the oil and gas industry. Is that they're much lower. Historically, the oil and gas industry, and the nuclear industry, did receive a fairly large amount of taxpayer subsidy, and in the form, genuinely of real tax benefits. But today, that's not the case at all. It's a remarkable difference between what the renewables receive and what the conventional fuels receive.
Oh, for sure. It's stunning. I'm glad you put the numbers together and saw that there's at least 23 different ways in which the renewable energy is subsidized or given advantage. So then that brings us to the whole idea of emissions. So all of this money being spent on renewables is supposed to lower our emissions. And so what are other countries doing with respect to emissions reduction, and where does Canada's efforts fit in?
Well, since 1990, when the efforts began internationally to achieve agreements on reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and 2020, global greenhouse gas emissions have increased 60%. So, in other words, after successive declarations and currently about $3.7 trillion in investment by countries, emissions are now 60% higher. In Canada's case, our emissions are about 21% higher than they were in 1990. If the reason why the increase is so high at a global level compared to what they are in OECD countries like Canada is that almost all of the emissions growth has occurred in the non-OECD countries. So that whereas they represented only about a third of the global emissions in 1990, today they represent 2/3. And that number is constantly increasing. China, in 2005, became the world's largest emitter. And today, while the numbers are not totally available, China's emissions are in the range of 28 to 30% of the global emissions, roughly double those of the United States. The United States emissions, incidentally, are declining faster than any other country, which it gets very little credit for. The countries like Canada have been making, again, similar major efforts to spend on emissions reduction, but we have increased our emissions. However, in total, Canada's greenhouse gas emissions are 1.6% of the global total. So if Canada disappeared off the face of the earth somehow, the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions would basically be made up globally in about a year or two as a result of increases that are occurring in Asia.
Right, for sure. And when I was looking at, I think it was the IEA numbers, and they showed the top 10 emitters, and Canada is like number 9 or 10 in the top 10. But China, who's number 1, their emissions were greater than all the other 9 in the top 10 combined. So Canada might be one of the top 10, but at 1.6%, like really? Is it that significant, especially with China producing so much? But I think part of the flip side of that is when China increased their emissions by using coal and nuclear and everything that they could everything available, they brought so many people out of poverty. And they increased the standard of living of their people so that they could have constant electricity and lots of food on the table and clean water and education and all of these things. And, there's these trade-offs, these balances that we were discussing earlier that don't seem to be considered when looking at these different policy options. Yeah.
I have always thought that the discussion of greenhouse gases is really a vast distraction from the real climate policy issue, because this is not about greenhouse gases. This is about the cost, availability, and reliability of the energy services upon which the people of the world depend. Yeah. And it's especially important for people in the developing countries because they have so few of them. They want to increase their standard of living and their income and their access to the types of energy uses that we in the developed countries take for granted. And what the climate policy agenda is attempting to do is basically to deprive them of that. I don't think it should come as any surprise that a country like India is now rapidly increasing its greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, by 2030, it's entirely possible that India will surpass the United States as the second largest emitter in the world. And they're doing that because they value the economic development benefits for their citizens. And I don't know by what standard the Western countries can claim that they're right not to do that. It's one of the great kind of surprising issues of our time that when so much time and effort and political discourse is related to talking about issues of equality and equity and human well-being, that in the climate area, we kind of turn our backs on that significant consideration.
You're absolutely right. And that I too find that extremely troubling because by giving up, like in the UK right now, there's an energy crisis that's created by government policies. And people, the gas stations are running out of fuel. 90% of the gas stations in the UK are empty, like they have no fuel. And they don't expect them to be full again for at least 3 days. I don't really know where they get that number from. The energy interconnection between France and the UK apparently is also needs repair. So the UK can't get enough energy for electricity that they import from France. So, it's a mess, and it's driven a lot by government policy, particularly these ones. And there doesn't seem to be much interest in what this means for how people are living. And by pursuing the energy transition so quickly. And it's not, if the science is settled and all this kinds of stuff, but if it's not settled, they keep saying it's settled, but if it isn't, then why are we pursuing this at breakneck speed? Because I'm looking at what's happening in the UK, and that's the future. By pushing so fast on the net zero transition, they keep saying it's a transition, but when the environmentalists are talking about, no, we have to end fossil fuel use today, that's not a transition.
I regard this as a very fascinating discussion that we're having, and it kind of opens the doors to all sorts of further topics. Let me just amplify a little bit what you've said in two different dimensions. One relating to the security of supply, and the other relating to the way in which the people are reacting to the issues. I started my career in energy policy at a time when the number one issue of concern was security of supply. It was in the immediate aftermath of the OPEC oil embargo in 1973-74. And of course, at that time, in many countries, people were seeing exactly the same sort of gasoline, or you call petrol, shortages that you're now seeing in the UK. And that had an enormous impact on people's sense of what was really important about energy. So from during the 1970s and 1980s, the number one concern of energy policymakers was to somehow ensure that never happened again, that we had secure and reliable supplies. And yet now, as is being demonstrated in the UK and in many other places, climate zealots are taking actions that seriously threaten the security of supply. And they're doing so in ways that will, I think, result in severe blowback from the general population on this. So the political consequences of ignoring security of supply concerns and of, in effect, like opening the door for countries like Russia to exercise very strong influence over policies of European countries may well be the thing that changes the view of the public about whether climate policy is on the right track or not.
I hope so, because I'm thinking about Germany, for example. They just had their election, which was about as conclusive as the Canadian election. And their last nuclear power plant will be decommissioned next year. That supplies, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of people. And Nord Stream 2, I think, is ready to come online as well. But once again, Russia, like you say, will have control of the tap. And so some people are saying, wow, they can just import LNG from other countries. Well, which ones that aren't also going to be competing against the European Union for that? And then there's the declining exports of the United States because of the Green New Deal policies being implemented there. And Canada can't even get stuff to the coast to help. So, yeah, it'll be the next little while will be interesting. And I hope you're right about people coming back to the idea of security of supply, because I think this is what's bothered me about the entire climate debate is what happened to energy security? What happened to the whole security argument? It's just security of supply. It's just gone. They talk about all of these other things, and no one really wants to engage with the security of supply issue. So I'm glad you brought it up. That was good.
Well, I'm glad. I mean, the irony, of course, the international organization that was formed in response to the security of supply crisis was the International Energy Agency, And ironically, the International Energy Agency has transformed itself from an organization concerned about security to one that devotes almost its entire attention to climate objectives. You talked earlier about maybe we should do away with the IPCC. We're well past time from when we should have done away with the International Energy Agency.
That's an interesting point. I had wrote a paper before looking at the evolution of the security of supply mandate of the International Energy Agency and how they evolved the definition over time to include being mindful of the environment. Well, sometimes those things are mutually exclusive, and then it becomes a matter of definition. Well, what exactly does that mean, caring for the environment and so on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's an interesting additional dimension to this, which I'm proposing to do some research on in future. There are the security of supply issues, and then there are what might be called the global strategic issues that are associated with the efforts to significantly reduce both greenhouse gas emissions and economic activity in the OECD countries. One of the major consequences of that has been the transfer of manufacturing from the OECD countries to the non-OECD countries, and again, mainly to Asia. It's not just been influenced by climate issues by any means. There are a number of other important influences on that as well. But the net effect of that is that with very low manufacturing capability relative to their consumption, the OECD countries are much more vulnerable to the kinds of military and strategic actions that could be taken by countries like China or Russia or North Korea or any other potential adversaries. And yet there is, even in a case like the United States, where formerly the many administrations were mesmerized by security and strategic issues, there's no attention to the effects that climate policy can play in that. I think that there's room for social scientists to begin to analyze what the consequences for international security issues there is resulting from climate change and from climate policies like those that are being adopted in countries like Germany.
That's a really good point, because the Defense Department has gone on and saying the most pressing issue is climate change and climate refugees and all this kind of stuff. But nowhere are they looking at what these climate policies do to jeopardize their own military security. So I think you're right. It would be great to see that social science research. I don't see it, though, coming out of the universities. I think it would have to be independent or like from a think tank or something, because I don't think they would get funding to do that, to be honest.
Yeah, you're probably right. And how sad that is. It's quite remarkable.
Well, it kind of comes back to this whole idea about the suppression of discourse and the suppression of investigating whether it's the science behind climate change or these other issues that have a knock-on effect from climate change policies. And I wonder, why do you think that is? Why isn't there free discussion of these ideas and free inquiry?
The answer to that is I really don't know. I mean, it's I mentioned earlier the very high level of political influence of environmental groups in Canada. In a sense, I didn't mention the complicity of the media in allowing poorly founded claims to be passed on as though they're the absolute truth. and the role that politicians have played in simply following along with the environmentalist creed. But the dimension of it that you're talking about, I mean, why do people tolerate the suppression of free views of just of dissent? Is very hard to understand because it goes so counter to the Western tradition that comes out of the Enlightenment, where the free competition of ideas was viewed as a way of advancing society's goals and making us all better. It's very perplexing. I mean, there are those who study far more than I the influences of some of these new political theories, like critical race theory and so on, and extent to which that is altering the willingness of people in universities to have a more open and even-handed debate about topics, because people are viewed as being the product of their race or their culture or their civilization, rather than of having a genuine commitment to integrity and the free flow of ideas. I really wish I could understand what's causing it, but I don't.
Fair enough. When I was editor of the HNet discussion list, H Energy, I tried to encourage discussion, and because that was the whole point of the HNet discussion networks. And when I first joined the networks as a student, there was quite robust discussions about various historical issues and even things pertaining to some extent national security issues and whatnot. And then it just the discussions just petered out. And so when I became editor, I noticed that scholars weren't having discussions anymore. We would have these round tables, it would all be very formalized or whatever, but there was very little people actually joining into a conversation. So I had a little survey and I asked, people, this will be confidential. Why isn't there much engagement and conversation? And the students and faculty who responded said, I'm afraid to say anything because I don't know if that's because it's archived, it's all archived, that my professor might look on there and that it'll affect my grade, or it might affect my tenure if I say anything too controversial, or I just, I don't want something to come back and bite me later, right? And when you look at cancel culture and things that happen to, say, for example, Brett Kavanaugh from when he was in high school, if they can do that to a Supreme Court justice nominee, what can they do to some, scholar who's trying to get tenure at a university? And so what I've seen, especially in the more, I guess, politicized discussion areas like energy or diplomacy, foreign policy, and so on, is there's very, very little discussion going on. Lots of reviews, lots of formalized stuff, but no real conversation. And there's just a lot of fear, and that it's, one, going to affect their employment prospects, and two, it'll affect their funding opportunities, right? So if you say the wrong things, you don't get the grants. And if you don't get the grants, you don't get the publications, you don't get the marks that go towards your tenure. So it sort of feeds itself in some respects, like the sort of closing off of discussion and free thought and free speech and free writing, because there's that knock-on effect.
Yes, I mean, one of the prime examples of how high this problem can rise is Dr. Judith Curry, the extraordinarily competent climate scientist who was formerly, I think, was the head of the School of Atmospheric Sciences at University, Georgia Tech University, yeah. I believe, in the United States. She was basically hounded out of her position by people who attacked her views, and she continues, fortunately, to be a very prominent voice on climate science, but she does so from having been really scolded by that particular experience. Dr. Tim Ball in Canada was one of our foremost climate scientists, and wrote extensively in the period from about 2005 to 2012. But he received so many death threats that out of concern for his family, he completely withdrew from the field. He no longer publishes or writes or attends meetings on these subjects. I mean, that's really terrifying, frankly, that people could be threatened in that way. I mean, in my case, fortunately, I'm a retired federal public servant in Canada, and there's very little they can threaten me with. So I will continue to say my piece.
Well, thank you for doing so. That it's great that there's people who can stand up and speak out on this. I think of somebody who in the industry who's really been speaking out is Chris Wright, who has a natural gas company in the United States, and he had that response to North Face, which went viral around the internet and whatnot. But he was so right. He's producing a product that they all use, but then want to virtue signal that they don't want anything to do with it, even though, petroleum products comprise 90% of anything that North Face produces, which is quite funny. So I had one last question for you today, and that was about this idea as we move towards net zero. There's various talks of carbon budgets. And part of the whole climate change thing is that we all have to keep track of what emissions we do, and each country will be assigned a certain amount of emissions. And I'm just wondering if you could explain the idea of the global carbon budget.
That is one of the most bizarre topics in this entire field, because the idea of a carbon budget basically arises out of the notion that there is an arbitrarily chosen start date at which one should measure emissions, an arbitrarily chosen end date at which emissions must meet some arbitrarily set target. And then to that, one guesses what the future emissions will be from future economic activity and emission rates. And then you calculate the maximum stock of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere that, if reached, would exceed this arbitrarily chosen temperature level. And you estimate when the current emission rates will exceed the stock. The whole exercise is subjective. There's nothing even remotely scientific about it, as far as I'm concerned. If you use the scenario that I talked about earlier, the IPCC 8.5 scenario, according to Carbon Tracker, which is one of the organizations that most closely follows emissions trends in the world, we will exceed our carbon budget by 2030. So, in theory, the whole world will stop then. If people took 10 minutes of serious thought to examine this, the whole idea of carbon budgets would be ridiculed, and we would be done with it. But as I'm sure you're aware, it's given no end of credibility, and it's thrown up every time that there's a discussion on the subject.
My concern is that this is going to be one of the things agreed upon at COP26 in Glasgow coming up here. I wouldn't be surprised, because they've trotted out that idea again of carbon allowances, and which was just published in Nature Sustainability a few weeks ago. So they're like, oh, okay, we have the vaccine passports. We can people are used to this idea now, so we can now have carbon passports that kind of piggyback onto it. And one of the authors is Tina Fawcett, and she's from Oxford and has been talking about this idea of carbon budgets, personal carbon trading, personal carbon allowances since like when Tony Blair was in power, I think, like 2008, 2007, since then. And she's never let it go. She's held on like a like a pit bull to this. So now she thinks it's got traction and that governments are more receptive, the people are more receptive. So I can just imagine at COP26, them deciding what the national carbon budget will be, and then having some algorithm defining what each individual's carbon allowance will be, and then having it on a little card or something, or on a smartphone app that tracks all your purchases. And I think Friends of Science had featured how MasterCard has this new thing that monitors your purchases for their carbon impact, and it'll cut you off if you've gone too far.
Well, I mean, you realize where all that is heading, because there's the bureaucracy that would be required to manage that type of a system would be the largest in history.
Sure.
But what they were really trying to do here, apart from being really silly, is to establish a situation whereby when you, quote, exceeded, unquote, your carbon budget, you'd have to then go buy credits, right? So that you could use more. Well, what would you do? Where would you'd buy those credits on the international credit market? And there are trillions of dollars to be made on the international carbon trading market. And that the people who are behind the desire to create such a market are just thrilled at the notion that governments would not only require companies to purchase carbon, so-called carbon credits, but they would require people, individuals, to have to buy it. Can you imagine the money to be made? It would be truly astounding. It
would be. And one of the things Mark Carney talked about last year, I think it was in August or September, he had a conversation with a group at Royal Roads University. And he was like, oh, this will be so great because you must understand it will be not governments forcing people to do this. It'll be individuals buying their credits from developing countries. In his mind, he's setting up this trading framework that will where you can buy carbon credits from people in Zimbabwe or some other place in the developing world. And that's how he sees that we transfer wealth from the Western economies to the developing economies.
And the transfer of income and wealth from the OECD countries to the non-OECD countries is one of the central objectives behind the entire climate policy agenda. If people haven't recognized that by now, they're just not watching.
And I think that also goes back to what you said about having offshored all of our manufacturing to developing countries. So not only do they make all our stuff, and now we're going to transfer money to them for other things. So yeah, I believe is where it's all heading, and I hope people can wake up and maybe push back against it, and maybe the UK energy crisis will help spur a movement even in Canada.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. And I hope we have a chance to speak again about net zero and the other issues that'll be coming up in the next little while.
Well, thank you very much. And I really admire you for your efforts to both to add to the public debate on this and to ask such insightful questions. I look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right. Bye for now.
Bye.